It was a cold London night, the kind where every breath hung in the air like a secret. But in the alley behind Fleet Street, something strange happened. A man exhaled once, and his breath never came back. No scream, no struggle, only a wisp of smoke that curled upward and vanished into nothing. When the police arrived, the body was gone, but the smoke still lingered, faint and deliberate, as though it waited to be noticed. That's when Sherlock Holmes stepped in, calm, sharp, and certain that the answer wasn't in what was seen, but in what disappeared, because sometimes the truth doesn't leave a trace. It fades with the air itself. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if mysteries like this pull you in, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because every week we uncover another shadow from the streets of Baker Street. Now, pick up your cup of tea, take a slow breath, and follow me through the fog. This is Sherlock Holmes and the breath that vanished in smoke. Chapter 1. The breath that vanished in smoke. It was a singularly bleak morning in early November when a rapping at our Baker Street door interrupted the stillness of our modest breakfast. The fog had settled thick along the streets of London, rolling and curling like ghostly fingers through the panes of our sitting-room window. Holmes, as ever, seemed invigorated by the gloom, reclining in his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes distant with thought. I had taken up the Times, but my attention was half lost in the steam of my tea when Mrs. Hudson's footsteps approached from the stairs. "A message, sir," she announced, setting a folded note upon the side table and retreating as swiftly as she had arrived. Holmes reached for the envelope with a lazy grace. "From Inspector Lestrade," he said, after a mere glance at the handwriting before cracking the seal. I noted the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth as he read the note, his eyes sharpening. "Well?" I prompted, lowering my paper. Holmes stood, shrugging into his coat with sudden purpose. "Lestrade has summoned us to Mornington Crescent. An incident most peculiar has taken place in the parlor of Lord Percival Addington. Incident, he says, that defies both sense and air." "Defies air," I repeated, bewildered. "His words, not mine," Holmes said briskly. "Apparently, a man is dead. Yet there is no wound, no sign of poison, and most intriguingly no breath upon his lips when he died. Only the lingering smell of Turkish tobacco." By now, I had set aside my breakfast entirely. Holmes' eyes glinted with that fierce curiosity I knew so well. "I take it we are to depart at once." "Indeed, Watson. Fetch your coat. The game, it would seem, has already begun to swirl." The house at Mornington Crescent loomed like a sentry in the fog, all blackened brick and ironwork fences with dagger-like tips. The butler, a rigid man named Alton, admitted us without word, his face pale as chalk and his lips trembling at the edges. "Lord Addington awaits you in the parlor, Mr. Holmes," he said, voice taut as a piano string. Holmes swept past him without pause. I followed, and we were ushered into a richly adorned room draped in heavy burgundy curtains. A fire smoldered low in the grate, casting little warmth. Slumped in a hubbaked chair before the hearth sat the corpse. The man was perhaps in his early 40s, dressed impeccably in a velvet smoking jacket. His hands rested calmly upon the arms of the chair, and his face bore no sign of pain or struggle. But it was his lips that drew my eye. and forgotten to draw breath again. Beside the body stood Inspector Lestrade, looking as perplexed as I had ever seen him. "Morning, Holmes, Dr. Watson. Quite the mess we've got here." Holmes gave a slight bow. "You were correct, Lestrade. It is very much a mess, but one of a distinctly curious fragrance." He stepped forward and leaned in close to the dead man's face, inhaling deeply. "Turkish blend, Murad, if I'm not mistaken. Expensive, not commonly sold." "Name is Mr. Tobias Grimble," Lestrade explained. "A close associate of Lord Addington's." They were reportedly discussing a matter of business when Lord Addington stepped out to answer a telegram. Returned not 2 minutes later to find Grimble as you see him, still and very much deceased. Holmes turned to Lord Addington, a gaunt man in his 60s, with a white mustache and eyes sunken from sleeplessness. He stood by the mantelpiece, wringing a handkerchief between his fingers. "You touched nothing?" Holmes asked. "Nothing at all," the Lord replied. He was alive when I left, speaking even when I returned. He looked as if he had simply stopped mid-thought. There was no sound, just silence and the tobacco." Holmes gestured toward a cut-glass ashtray on the side table. A cigarette, long extinguished, lay within. He brought his own. "Smoked incessantly," Tobias did. "Always that particular brand. Strong, very aromatic." Holmes studied the cigarette, then turned his attention to the sideboard. There was a decanter, 2 crystal tumblers, and a half-finished glass of what I took to be cognac. Holmes lifted it, sniffed, and took a drop to his tongue. Unadulterated, curious. He then crossed to the window, throwing back the heavy curtain. The panes were sealed, and no latch had been disturbed, and the door, Lestrade, locked from the inside, the inspector confirmed. Addington had the key in his pocket. No one else entered or exited. An impossible death. "Then," I said quietly, trying to quell the unease rising in my gut. "No poison, no wound, no chance of an intruder, only a dead man and the scent of tobacco." Holmes' eyes were half-lidded now, his mind racing. "We are dealing, Watson, with a death wrapped in silence, a breath extinguished without violence. But smoke never lies. It drifts, it clings, it marks where it's been." He turned on his heel. "I shall need an examination of Grimble's lungs, Watson, this evening, if possible. Also, Lestrade, send for a list of recent shipments of Murad cigarettes. I believe our killer has left us a trail, one of the most subtle kind." "Do you have a suspect already?" Lestrade asked, half hopeful, half incredulous. Holmes smiled faintly. "Not yet, but I have a breath, and soon I shall have the one who stole it." And with that, Holmes returned to the fire, crouching like a cat before the hearth, staring into the smoke as if it whispered secrets no one else could hear. Chapter 2. A curl in the curtain. It was 3:30 when Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, the damp fog still trailing us like a mourner's veil. Holmes, wrapped in his long gray coat, spoke not a word the entire cab ride, his gaze fixed upon some distant, abstract horizon only he could see. I had learned not to interrupt him during these spells of inward calculation. His silences, though often disconcerting, were the fertile ground in which his most extraordinary insights took root. Inside our sitting room, he peeled off his coat and took to the violin, drawing forth a soft, brooding tune that suited the hour perfectly. I sat across from him, composing my thoughts and jotting the first details of the Mornington Crescent affair into my notebook. Grimble died without struggle. I mused aloud. No mark on his body, no scent of poison in his drink. But something did this to him, something swift, invisible, and final. Holmes did not cease his playing, but replied with a nod. You speak of evidence, Watson. I am contemplating cause. Death leaves fingerprints on the air. Only one knows how to see them. The melody ceased. He placed the violin aside and reached for his pipe. The first clouds of smoke were exhaled with an almost reverent slowness. Murad cigarettes, he said, turning the thought in his mouth like a morsel of unfamiliar flavor. Expensive, rare, and not commonly found outside certain circles. The choice of a man with wealth or someone pretending to it. And Lord Addington, I asked, you believe him to be sincere? Holmes considered. He is a relic, Watson. A man out of time, too old-fashioned for deception. I find his shock genuine. Still, sincerity does not preclude omission. At that moment, a knock echoed from below. Within seconds, Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a note upon a silver tray. Holmes accepted it, read it, and smiled thinly. Ah, prompt as ever. Lestrade's men have already gathered a list of tobacconists in London known to import Murad cigarettes. Only 3 establishments handle them. One, in Soho, keeps a private client list. I think it's time we paid them a visit. The shop in question was nestled between a tailor and a music hall on Berwick Street. It was a narrow place, darkly wood-paneled, and rich with the scent of aged tobacco leaf and exotic smoke. Behind the counter stood a short man in a brocade waistcoat, his eyes alert behind spectacles. Mr. Holmes, he greeted us with quick recognition. I received word from Inspector Lestrade. You're here regarding the Holmes gave a brief nod. Correct. I'm seeking any recent purchases of that particular brand, especially any transactions involving Mr. Tobias Grimble or his associates. The tobacconist consulted a leather-bound ledger beneath the counter. We keep strict records for Murad buyers, a condition of our importer. He turned the book and pointed. Mr. Tobias Grimble, yes, a regular purchaser, came every Friday without fail. Always 2 packs, paid in coin, never credit. But last week the man tapped the line again. He took only 1. Holmes' brow lifted. Interesting. Any comment as to why the change? He said something odd, the tobacconist recalled. No need for the second, he said. It'll be smoke enough for both of us. Thought it strange at the time. Holmes shot me a look. Smoke enough for both of us, he repeated. A remark far too casual for a man known for precision. Do you know if Mr. Grimble ever brought others with him? The man shook his head. Always alone. Though once I saw him deep in discussion outside with a man in a black frock coat. Never came in. Holmes straightened. Can you describe this man? Tall, pale, with a walking stick. Mannered, a bit theatrical. He had a shock of blonde hair. Foreign accent. German, perhaps. That's all I recall. Did he purchase anything? No, sir. Then he was there to be seen, not to buy, Holmes muttered. We took our leave shortly thereafter, and Holmes walked in silence until we turned onto Wardour Street. He halted suddenly before the railings of a quiet square. Watson, he said, what do you make of the phrase, it'll be smoke enough for both of us? I considered it. Perhaps he was sharing a cigarette with someone. Or, Holmes said grimly, perhaps someone else intended to use that cigarette for more than mere camaraderie. Poisoning a cigarette is devilishly difficult, mind you, but not impossible. Especially if one were to inject something into the filter or tip. But wouldn't it taste different? Precisely why it would only work if the smoker was unaware of any change. Now, Watson, think a man dies mid-sentence, no visible distress, no struggle, only silent sand smoke, then the cigarette may not have been what it seemed. That evening, I conducted a thorough examination of Mr. Grimble's lungs at St. Bartholomew's with the assistance of Dr. Woodrow, our trusted colleague in the mortuary wing. There was no obvious sign of asphyxiation or traditional toxins. The lungs were pale, but not congested. I did, however, note a faint residue upon the bronchial lining, something waxy and chemical in nature. Returning late, I found Holmes awake and pacing. "Well?" he asked, barely containing his impatience. I relayed my findings. Holmes received them with a deepening of the eyes, as if confirming some internal theory. "A chemical coating in the airway," he murmured. "Invisible, insidious, enough to stop the breath without breaking the body. And perhaps, Watson, our killer needed only a few grains of the right compound, delivered directly to the lungs." He sat suddenly, lighting a match and holding it to a scrap of the same Turkish tobacco. The flame danced. Then his stand extinguished itself. Holmes stared at the curling smoke as it rose. "There's a curl in the curtain, Watson, and it's time we saw what lies behind it." Chapter 3. The Man in the Velvet Chair. The morning after our visit to the tobacconist broke, dull and cold. The sky the color of soot. I had scarcely finished my tea when Holmes emerged from his room, fully dressed and gloved. His expression taut with that rarest combination restlessness and certainty. He paced twice across the room before speaking. "We must return to Mornington Crescent, Watson," he said. "There is something about that sitting room I've yet to grasp. Something spatial, arrangement, direction, placement. The scene was too clean." I followed him out without question, sensing in his clipped tone the presence of some growing intuition. In Holmes' world, such moments often preceded startling breakthroughs. When we arrived once more at Lord Addington's residence, the butler Alton showed us in without ceremony, his lips pressed tightly as though he feared they might betray some secret. Lord Addington stood at the window of the parlor, arms clasped behind his back, unmoved by our entrance. "I've hardly slept," he murmured. "I keep seeing him, sitting there, as if he might wake and ask me to fetch more brandy." Holmes gave him only the faintest nod before turning his full attention to the scene of the crime. The velvet armchair still stood before the fireplace, though the body had long since been removed. A faint scent of tobacco still lingered in the drapery. Holmes crouched before the chair, examining the arms and cushion with his lens. I watched as he traced the grain of the fabric, then paused. "What do you see?" I asked quietly. "Nothing." "Which is precisely the problem," he replied. "No ash, no burn, no discoloration. Grimble was said to have been smoking when he died, but where is the evidence? A man as habitual as he would never flick ash on the carpet, yet neither is there a trace in the tray." He rose and moved to the window. "Let us consider, Watson. Grimble smoked often. He brought his own cigarettes. He lit one here, in this chair. He spoke. Then, in the span of 2 minutes, he ceased to live. And yet the cigarette found spent in the ashtray was untouched. How does a man die before finishing his smoke? A cold shiver passed through me. Perhaps it was planted there, I suggested, to suggest normalcy. Holmes nodded approvingly. Precisely. The scene is arranged. Death came too suddenly, and the aftermath too calmly. Even the drink the cognac was poured, but barely sipped. He turned sharply to Lord Addington. "Forgive me, my lord, but did you see Grimble light the cigarette himself?" Addington blinked. No, I had just returned from the hall. I saw the smoke, yes, and the smell lingered. And yet you never observed him in the act. I suppose not, he admitted. Holmes pursed his lips. Curious, very curious. We stepped out into the hallway and requested to speak again with the butler, Alton. He arrived with visible discomfort, his hands twisting the edge of his jacket. "I will ask you plainly, Mr. Alton," Holmes began. "Did you prepare anything in the parlor prior to Mr. Grimble's visit?" Alton looked briefly to Lord Addington, then back at Holmes. "Only the fire, sir. It had burned low from the morning, and I restoked it shortly before Lord Addington received his guest." "Did you handle the cigarette case or glassware?" "No, sir. Mr. Grimble brought his own case." Holmes nodded. "Thank you." We returned to Baker Street not long after, both of us quiet in the cab. Once home, Holmes tossed his coat across the armchair and immediately returned to the hearth, examining the coals as though seeing them anew. "Watson," he said abruptly, "have you ever heard of vaporized toxins?" I furrowed my brow. "In theory, yes. Some rare poisons, when burned or heated, can render their fumes lethal. But they are notoriously difficult to deliver, and even more so to direct without harming others." "Precisely why it fascinates me," Holmes replied. "The fire was restoked, the cigarette possibly a decoy, and yet the smoke in that room carried something decisive." He crossed to his desk and pulled down a leather-bound volume, Poisons, Rare and Obscure, by Sir Malden Ferris. "Here," he said, jabbing a page. "Conium vaporatum, a rare preparation derived from hemlock, distilled and rendered into oil. When exposed to flame, it vaporizes, invisible, yet potent when inhaled in concentrated doses." "And if mixed with tobacco?" I asked. "It could mask the origin," Holmes said grimly, "and give the illusion of an ordinary smoke, especially if prepared carefully." I thought back to the tobacconist's words. Holmes, what if the man in the frock coat, blonde hair, foreign accent, was the chemist, the supplier of the poisoned cigarette? Holmes tapped the arm of his chair. "Very likely. And Grimble's last words to the tobacconist, 'Smoke enough for both of us,' may have meant he was expecting company. The death was meant to be shared. But the other man did not perish." "No," Holmes said, eyes narrowing, "because he did not smoke." Later that evening, just as the gas lamps flickered to life across the city, a telegram arrived from Lestrade. "Holmes, read it," then passed it to me without a word. "Foreign gentleman matching description, seen entering lodging at 14 Savile Row 3 days prior to Grimble's death. Name given, Herr Lucas Eberhard, German national, currently absent from residence." Holmes exhaled through his nose. "We have a name, and soon we shall have more. Make ready Watson, we visit Savile Row at dawn. And so the pieces gathered, dark and deliberate, around a death that spoke no words, and a breath that vanished in smoke. Chapter 4. The lodger at Savile Row. It was shortly after sunrise when Holmes and I arrived at the address in Savile Row, the street, known more for its tailors than its mysteries, stood quiet in the early morning fog, its elegant buildings stoic and aloof. Number 14 was a handsome townhouse with ivy creeping up its west-facing wall, its windows shut tight against the November chill. Holmes rang the bell with a crisp motion, and moments later the door was opened by a woman of about 50, with sharp features and watchful eyes. She wore a starched apron and bore the unmistakable air of a landlady who ran her household like a naval frigate. "Mrs. Rigby?" Holmes asked. She nodded, narrowing her gaze. "That I am. We're here on behalf of Scotland Yard," he said smoothly, flashing a card that Lestrade had provided for such moments. "We seek information about your lodger, Herr Lucas Eberhardt. German, is he? That explains the coat. Never met a foreigner who didn't dress like he were on stage." She stepped aside reluctantly, motioning us in. "Come through, then. I've nothing to hide." The interior bore the scent of lemon polish and old rugs. She led us to a sitting room, gesturing toward a low chair as she stood, arms crossed like a fortress. "Mr. Eberhardt took the upstairs front room a week ago. Paid in advance. Very quiet. Came and went odd hours. No visitors. Has he returned since Tuesday evening?" Holmes asked. She shook her head. "No. I knocked yesterday morning to ask about laundry. No answer. Still no sign of him. Haven't seen hide nor hair. Would you object if we had a look inside his quarters?" Her lips tightened, but she nodded. "Very well, but I'll be coming with you. I won't have you disturbing the furnishings." The upstairs room was modest, but carefully arranged. A trunk stood near the wall, its lock already disengaged. A small valise lay half-packed on the bed, as if its owner had departed in haste. Holmes strode in without hesitation and went straight to the writing desk by the window. The top drawer held a single sheet of paper, folded once. Holmes opened it carefully, frowning as he read. "The circle closes. The breath returns. If I vanish, it is by design, not defeat." He held it up for my inspection. "Watson, this is not the writing of a man who intended to stay long." I read the note again. What does he mean by "the breath returns"? An allusion to the death, no doubt. A poetic phrase or a guilty one. Holmes turned his attention to the trunk. Inside were a few neatly folded garments, a pair of gloves, and a bundle of papers tied with red twine. He examined the bundle closely, then drew out a sheet bearing a small embossed emblem in the corner. A serpent coiled around a burning censer. I recognized the symbol at once. That's the insignia of the Medicorum Institute. They specialize in toxicological studies, do they not? Holmes nodded. And chemical experimentation. It seems our Herr Eberhardt has ties to them. Likely studied there before coming to England. He flipped through the remaining papers. Most were scientific treatises in German, Latin, even Greek. One was handwritten, in a neat but forceful script, and bore the title, "Vapors and Their Human Affinity." Holmes read aloud. "It is not the body that rejects air, but the mind that forgets to desire it. Induce that forgetting death becomes a mere pause. He lowered the paper slowly. "Good Lord," I muttered. He was perfecting it. Holmes turned away, expression grim, and Grimble may have been either his test subject or his witness. Just then, Mrs. Rigby, who had remained uncomfortably in the hallway, called out, "Beg pardon, but this was under the stair carpet. Someone must have dropped it in haste." She handed Holmes a matchbox. "Ordinary, save for the initials T.G. scratched into the lid. Tobias Grimble's," I said. Holmes opened it and sniffed the interior. "Smells of ... camphor," he murmured, "and something sharper." He reached into his coat and withdrew a glass vial, placing a fragment of the matchbox lining inside before sealing it. "We'll send this to St. Bart's for analysis," he said, "but I'd wager a sovereign we'll find traces of vaporized alkaloid, possibly the very compound used in Grimble's cigarette." He straightened and turned to Mrs. Rigby. "Mr. Eberhart ever speak of Mr. Grimble?" She frowned. "Once, I think. He mentioned meeting an Englishman too curious for his own health. I didn't pry." Holmes gave her a brief nod. "You've been most helpful." Back at Baker Street, Holmes retired to his armchair and stared at the window. The fog outside was thicker now, and the street lamps had begun to glow like amber eyes in the haze. "This isn't just a case of murder, Watson," he said at last. "It's something stranger. This man, Eberhart, was playing with the edge of science, turning air itself into a weapon. Grimble may have discovered the truth, and the consequence." He gestured vaguely, as though the rising smoke from his pipe bore the answer. "The matchbox was left behind deliberately," I suggested. "A bread—" Holmes shook his head. "A warning. Perhaps even an apology. Eberhart is no common killer. He plays with guilt, symbolism, the serpent and the censor, knowledge and breath." A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson appeared, holding a telegram. "Holmes, read it silently. German consulate confirms Lucas Eberhart studied chemical anesthesia. Expelled for unlicensed experimentation. Location now unknown." He lowered the telegram and sighed. "So the man we seek," I said slowly, "is a chemist turned phantom, slipping through the city with a poison only he understands." Holmes looked up, his eyes alight. "Yes, Watson. And the deeper question now is not merely how Grimble died, but why Eberhart left him alive long enough to speak." He tapped the edge of his pipe thoughtfully. "Somewhere in all this vapor and silence, a motive waits still breathing." Chapter 5. The Whisper in the Walls. It was shortly after 9 the following morning when Inspector Lestrade paid an unannounced visit to Baker Street, his face ruddy with exertion and his mustache askew from the damp wind. Holmes, who had risen early and was already knee-deep in German medical journals, looked up from his reading with a trace of amusement. "You bring news," he said, gesturing toward the hearth with a flick of his hand. "Do sit. You're steaming like a struck kettle." Lestrade accepted the invitation with a grunt and removed his gloves. "You were right about Grimble, Holmes. The pathologist at St. Bartholomew's confirmed itrazudu in the lungs, an untraceable compound derived from alkaloid vapors. No known antidote. If you hadn't asked for a special analysis, we'd never have known to look." Holmes gave a faint nod but said nothing. "But there's more," Lestrade continued. "We looked deeper into Grimble's business affairs. On paper, he was a tobacco importer and cultural liaison consulting with foreign delegates. that sort of thing. But one of our analysts noticed a discrepancy in his finances. He was receiving monthly deposits from an anonymous patron, fairly large sums, sent through intermediaries. The most recent came 3 days before his death. Watson leaned forward. Blackmail. Lestrade shrugged. Perhaps. But here's the twist. One of those intermediaries was traced to a company called Thanamark Holdings, registered in Zurich. And guess who appears on their board as a silent partner? Holmes' eyes narrowed. No, Lord Percival Addington. The name hung in the air like a breath that refused to be exhaled. I repeated. But he claimed to be Grimble's friend. Lestrade grimaced. Possibly he was, but the financial link is there. He's invested in the same firm paying Grimble's retainer. Either he knew what Grimble was doing, or was complicit in silencing him. Holmes rose slowly and began to pace. Addington may be more than just a grieving host. The money suggests hidden knowledge, possibly pressure. But if he wanted Grimble dead, he could have hired any blunt instrument. Instead, he played host to a death so delicate it mimicked disappearance. He stopped abruptly. Unless he didn't expect Grimble to die at all. Lestrade blinked. I beg your pardon. Holmes' gaze darkened. What if Grimble was supposed to be silenced but not fatally? A warning, a hallucination, a whisper in the lungs. But the dosage was wrong. Or someone interfered, I asked. Or someone using his method, Holmes replied. Either way, the threads are tightening. Later that afternoon, Holmes and I paid a second visit to Lord Addington. He received us in the library this time, seated stiffly beside a stack of correspondence, a snifter of brandy untouched at his elbow. I had rather hoped that my part in this affair was concluded. Your hope, Holmes replied dryly, was premature. Addington gave a sigh, almost theatrical in its gravity. Very well. What is it now? Holmes seated himself across from him. We've discovered your financial involvement with Thanamark Holdings, a company connected to the anonymous payments made to Mr. Tobias Grimble. Care to comment? A flicker crossed the older man's face, there and gone again. I invested in Thanamark years ago, he said carefully. Its foreign holdings were promising. I had no knowledge of any direct payments to Grimble. But you were acquainted with him, Holmes pressed. Intimately enough to host him for private discussions. Addington nodded stiffly. He was brilliant, unorthodox. His work in tobacco trade opened channels few dared to touch. But he had darker interests. He spoke once of altering the mind through breath. I thought it a joke, a metaphor. Did you ever meet Lucas Eberhard? Addington's fingers tightened slightly around the arm of his chair. Once Grimble introduced us at a private club in Belgravia. The man unsettled me. He spoke of consciousness like it was a disease. I refused further meetings. Yet Grimble continued to associate with him. Obsessively, Addington murmured. He once said Eberhard could burn silence into the lungs. I didn't know what he meant. Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then, you said, Grimble was speaking when you left the parlor. Do you recall what he was saying? Addington frowned. Something vague, rambling. He was quoting a line from Goethe, I believe. Try to recall it precisely. The Lord hesitated, then spoke slowly. Der Atem stilt. Bever das Herz ease wagged. The breath ceases before the heart dares. Holmes' expression did not change. But I could sense his mind racing. A poetic line, he said, but perhaps not metaphorical. That evening, Holmes returned to the scene of Grimble's death one last time alone. I remained at Baker Street, preparing notes and cataloging what we had learned. The hour passed slowly, the wind clawing at the windows. Just past 10, the front door swung open, and Holmes stepped in with a purpose that bordered on urgency. "You've found something," I said. He removed his gloves. I did. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, an ivory button, cracked across its center. I found it tucked beneath the left leg of the velvet chair. Not Grimble's style, not Addington's, but it matches a waistcoat worn by Eberhard in a photograph sent to me by the German consulate. He was in that room, despite Addington's claim. He was there during the meeting, or just before, Holmes said. Perhaps he slipped in, prepared the scene, left the poisoned cigarette. Or perhaps he never left at all, not by the front door. He turned and pointed to the fireplace. There's a hollow space behind the mantel. I found soot displaced along the stone, a smear, narrow, as if a gloved hand had braced against it. There may be a second exit, a servant's passage. Eberhard could have watched it all, unseen. I felt a chill rise. You think he was testing his method, watching it unfold, or testing Addington, Holmes replied. There's more to this than a murder, Watson. Grimble's death may have been the opening move. A breath stolen to silence a voice or to issue a warning. He turned toward the window, where the fog once again coiled like breath on glass, and somewhere out there, the man who controls the air waits for us to take another. Chapter 6. The secret clue was in the early hours of the morning. That strange and shifting time between moon and gaslight, when Holmes' theory began to coalesce into something more than conjecture. I found him seated at the window of our sitting room, staring out into the fog with a cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. A half-finished note lay on the desk, marked by several corrections and a series of tight, underlined words in German. You haven't slept, I observed, stepping into the room. Sleep, he said absently. It is the great thief of precision, Watson. No, I've been charting. Charting what? He pointed to the page. A timeline of conversations, lies, and absences. Grimble's last week in London. His visit to the tobacconist. The transaction from Thanamark Holdings. His cryptic remark, "Smoke enough for both of us." Addington's Goethe quotation. And now, Eberhard's Vanishing. I glanced at the page. It was dense with cross-hatched arrows, chemical notations, and phrases circled multiple times. Asterisk. Holmes tapped a particular section. There's something missing. A link. Eberhard's presence at the scene was indirect. He prepared, observed, possibly fled through the servant's passage, but there is still no definitive proof that he administered the fatal agent. Not unless... He trailed off, fingers drumming against his knee. Then he rose abruptly. Come, Watson. There is one place we've not returned to. The tobacconist's shop on Berwick Street was shuttered when we arrived, but Holmes knocked with quiet insistence until the proprietor, bleary-eyed and wrapped in a woolen shawl, answered. Mr. Holmes. Is it urgent? Only for the truth, Holmes said. I require another look at your Murad inventory. Specifically, the pack sold to Mr. Grimble last Friday. The man blinked. I'm afraid I can't. Those are sold loose. No serialization, no marking. He selected them from the case himself. Holmes stepped inside, uninvited, moving swiftly toward the glass display. Did anyone else examine this case after Mr. Grimble? Only Mr. Eberhard, the blond fellow. He came in the same afternoon, stood here for a moment, didn't buy anything, just looked. Said he was seeking a flavor from memory. Odd thing to say, I thought. Holmes turned to me. Watson, do you recall how Grimble's cigarette was intact, burned neatly to the filter? Yes, I said. It appeared to have been smoked, but very precisely. Almost too clean, indeed. It was tampered with, but not here. This is not the stage of crime, it was the staging ground. He leaned forward, scanning the trays, then pointed to a brass strip that lined the interior of the case. Do you keep this polished? He asked. The man frowned. Once a week, on Sundays. Holmes drew a cloth from his pocket and ran it along the strip. A dark smudge appeared so faint it could have been mistaken for dust. And this is where the clue lies. He turned, eyes gleaming. Eberhard didn't poison Grimble's cigarette after purchase. He swapped it, planted one identical in appearance, but laced with vaporized alkaloid. He knew Grimble's routine, knew where he purchased his supply. It was child's play to visit before him and slip in a singular counterfeit. The tobacconist was visibly disturbed. You mean, my shop was used as the delivery system? Inadvertently, yes, Holmes replied, which raises the next question. Why go to such elaborate lengths if the intent was only to kill? He paced the narrow floor of the shop. No, this wasn't simply murder. It was a message, and Grimble might have known it. Back at Baker Street, Holmes lit his pipe and stared into the hearth. Watson, he said, when a man is about to be silenced, what does he do? I considered. He tells someone, or writes something. Precisely. Grimble was intelligent, perhaps too intelligent for his own safety. If he knew he was being followed or manipulated, he would have left a record. Not obvious, of course, but something. You mean a letter? Possibly. Or a journal. But nothing was found among his belongings. Holmes smiled faintly, which means it was never meant to be found by ordinary means. He stood abruptly and fetched a book from the shelf. Cryptographs and ciphers of the 19th century. What if Grimble encoded his words? He asked. What if the final message wasn't in his possessions, but somewhere only someone like Eberhard would think to look? Later that evening, we received an urgent note from Lestrade. New development. Secondary apartment in Grimble's name discovered. Rented under pseudonym Charles Durant. Address follows. Please advise. Holmes read the address and rose at once. There it is. The whisper we were waiting for. Come, Watson, we have a second stage to uncover. The apartment was tucked behind a milliner's shop on Fleet Street. A modest two-room flat, sparely furnished but meticulously clean. There were no signs of habitation, no food, no clothing, no photographs. But Holmes was undeterred. He moved to the writing desk and opened every drawer with careful fingers. At last, he found it wedged behind the bottom panel, a slim, leather-bound volume. It bore no title, only a silver clasp. Holmes opened it slowly. Inside were pages filled with tight handwriting, numbers interspersed with short phrases and diagrams. A ciphered journal, he murmured. Grimble's true thoughts. The code is numerical, possibly substitution. And here this passage. He showed me a page. The air turns against itself. Eberhard believes the future breathes in silence, but the silence must be broken. Holmes looked up, eyes hard. Grimble was planning to expose Eberhard's work. He feared it, but he also believed he could stop it. This is what he died for, Watson, not money, not blackmail, truth. I felt a weight settle in the room. And now, Holmes said, we know what must be done. Chapter 7. Echoes of a vanishing man. The following day dawned slate gray, and the air carried a chill that sliced between collar and skin. Holmes, journal in hand, sat beneath the flickering lamp in our sitting room. Pages spread across the table like a mosaic of buried truths. The ciphered notes from Grimble's hidden diary now occupied his complete attention, and though I dared not disturb him, I could not help but watch his methodical mind at work. He murmured as he traced symbols with his finger. Columnar transposition, but inconsistent. He's masked the frequency. Every fourth line shifts the pattern. After another quarter hour of near silence, he leaned back and exhaled. There, he said, Grimble left more than riddles. He left a location. A location, I repeated, leaning forward. Holmes tapped a decoded line. Where the air first changed may beneath the pipes of St. Anne's. St. Anne's, I said, puzzled. The old chapel in Lambeth. The same, Holmes said, rising. Disused since the fire of '92, but the basement remains intact and its catacombs are infamous among those who deal in things best left unseen. Then you believe that's where Eberhard performed his early experiments, or where Grimble first witnessed them, Holmes said grimly. Whatever changed him, it began there. That's where this trail of smoke and silence wins next. The sun was low in the sky when we reached Lambeth. Its dying light filtered through chimney stacks and warehouse roofs. St. Anne's Chapel stood like a weary sentinel, its charred steeple casting long shadows over the vacant lot where once a church garden bloomed. The front doors had long since collapsed, and ivy now clung to blackened stone. We entered through a crumbling side arch. Dust choked the air. Beneath our feet, broken tiles clicked like bones. Holmes found the basement stair behind a collapsed lectern. We descended in near darkness, our lanterns throwing fitful light across brick walls and rusting iron. There Holmes whispered, pointing at the far end of the corridor. Half obscured behind a toppled altar lay a steel-plated door, old, industrial, out of place in a house of worship. He examined the lock, tampered, opened recently. With a firm tug, it groaned open. The chamber beyond was colder, its air still and strange. It had once been a crypt, but now it resembled a laboratorial biot. Tables lined the walls, bearing dusty glassware, ash-stained burners, and the unmistakable yellowing scent of aged chemicals. I shivered as we stepped inside. Look here, Holmes said. On the central table sat a copper inhaler, similar to those used by asthmatic patients, though fitted with an extra valve and filter. Holmes lifted it with gloved hands. Modified, he murmured. Designed to filter fumes, possibly to regulate dosage. Primitive, but deliberate. He turned to the wall, where crude diagrams had been drawn in charcoal. Chemical formulas, respiratory charts, and in the center a figure of a man, crouched, head bowed, with vapor swirling around him in a spiral. Beneath the sketch breathed silence. And you shall know. Monstrous, I muttered. He treated breath like a door to another state. Holmes nodded, but his attention was now on a series of glass slides beside the sketch. He held one up to the lantern. Embedded within was a dark residue, traces of plant oil, ash, and what looked like conium. "This is where it began," he said. "Eberhard created his compound here, distilled silence itself." We turned at the sound of faint movement behind the wall. Holmes immediately extinguished the lantern. We stood motionless. From behind a bricked-over arch came a soft, hiss-like steam escaping a valve. Then nothing. After a long pause, Holmes relit the lantern. "He was here," he said, "not long ago. He's watching this place. Perhaps guarding it." I shuddered. "Why guard what he abandoned?" Holmes looked around the chamber one last time. "Because this isn't abandoned," he said. "It's staged. Left for discovery. A warning to intruders. A whisper in brick and smoke." Back at Baker Street, night had fully fallen. Holmes sent the slide and inhaler to St. Bartholomew's for chemical analysis and resumed his work on Grimble's journal. I pored over the decoded sections as best I could, trying to divine the full meaning. One passage stood out. Even in its rough translation, "The man in the velvet chair will not be the last. He is the first to breathe the mirror." Eberhard promised release, but gave only shadow. "The air does not carry truth, carries forgetting." I handed it to Holmes. "What do you make of that?" He read it twice. "The mirror. The forgetting. I believe Grimble feared not only death, but erasure. The chemical doesn't just kill it, it alters perception, perhaps even memory. The breath that vanished in smoke, a man who forgets to be alive before he is dead." He stood slowly, as though the thought weighed his limbs. "We are not chasing a killer, Watson," he said. "We are chasing an idea weaponized." He turned to the window. The fog beyond was growing thicker, crowding the glass like a smothering cloth. "We must move carefully now. Eberhard is always one step ahead, not because he hides, but because he understands what we refuse to, that fear doesn't begin in the body. It begins in the breath." Chapter 8. The breath beneath the surface, thick silence settled over Baker Street the next morning. Even the usual clatter of horses' hooves and vendors' calls seemed muted by the fog, which pressed heavily against the windows like a muffling veil. Holmes stood unmoving by the fire, staring down into the ashes as if they contained some secret not yet revealed. "St. Anne's," he said at last, without turning. "It wasn't simply a laboratory, it was a theater." I looked up from the pages of Grimble's decoded journal, still puzzled by the phrases we'd found. The mirror breath, release through forgetting, and the velvet passage. "You mean it was arranged?" I asked. "Staged for effect?" "Exactly. Eberhard wanted someone to find Utas, perhaps," Holmes said. "He plants ideas as carefully as he plants poison." The chamber was meant to unsettle, not inform. He paced to the desk and tapped the open journal. Grimble was terrified by what he saw. Not merely the chemical experimentation, but what it implied. That breath, our most unconscious act, could be altered, corrupted. That memory, perception, and selfhood could be turned inward, made traitorous. He closed the journal with care. "This isn't about death alone, Watson. It's about control. Eberhard's method allows for something subtler than murder. Manipulation." Holmes nodded. "Imagine making a man forget his intentions, surrender his secrets. even betray himself. All without blade or threat, only a breath prepared in silence. A knock came at the door before I could reply. It was a courier bearing a sealed envelope, thick ivory paper marked with the crest of the German consulate. Holmes broke it open and read aloud. Lucas Eberhardt was expelled from the Medicorum Institute not solely for unauthorized experiments, but for altering patient recollections under test conditions. Unverified accounts suggest induced hallucinations and memory loss. Subject journals refer to Verloren Atom, the lost breath. Holmes folded the letter slowly. Confirmation at last. So Grimble wasn't merely murdered, he was experimented upon. Worse, he may have volunteered or believed he did. The payment from Thanamark Holdings, his visits to Eberhardt, the symbolic language in the journal. He may have been trying to understand, even replicate, the very process that killed him. I found the notion deeply unsettling. And if someone else were to perfect it? Holmes raised a hand. Then London's drawing rooms become laboratories, parliaments, stages. Silence becomes a weapon. Which brings us, he said, turning sharply, to Thanamark. By late morning, we were seated in the London offices of Thanamark Holdings on austere suite in a stone building off Chancery Lane. A polite secretary led us into a private conference room with a high ceiling and shuttered windows. Moments later, a thin man in a black cravat entered. He introduced himself as Mr. Harford, the firm's financial manager. "We understand you're inquiring about Mr. Tobias Grimble," he said, folding his hands. Holmes gave him a pleasant nod. "We are." Harford offered a faint smile. Mr. Grimble was indeed retained for consultation regarding certain overseas trade arrangements. Beyond that, I'm afraid confidentiality precludes disclosure. Holmes steepled his fingers. "And what of his partner, Lucas Harford's smile vanished. "Eberhardt was never formally associated with us, but funds originating through Thanamark passed to Grimble through pseudonymous accounts," Holmes said calmly. "Would you care to explain the discrepancy?" Harford shifted. "If such funds existed, they were likely routed through our Zurich branch. Our London records show no involvement." Holmes rose suddenly, moving to the bookcase behind Harford's desk. He pulled down a thick black ledger, ran his finger across the spine, and paused. "This volume, I think," he said. "If I may?" Harford made a weak protest as Holmes opened the book and flipped several pages. He stopped at an entry dated 2 weeks before Grimble's death. Consultant Giri Ventus. Request confirmed. Sample transport approved. He turned the ledger toward Harford. Ventus, Latin for breath or wind. Harford paled. "You weren't paying Grimble for trade," Holmes said softly. "You were funding a trial, or a demonstration. Something Eberhardt had designed and Grimble had reluctantly agreed to facilitate." "I didn't know what it was," Harford said quickly. "We were told it was medicinal, new anesthetic, intended for field hospitals, nothing more." "But someone knew better," Holmes said. "And when Grimble attempted to extract himself, they ensured he'd never speak." We returned to Baker Street in silence. Holmes' face was unreadable, his brow furrowed in concentration. Once home, he went immediately to his files and retrieved an old clipping. "Do you recall the Minslow affair?" he asked. "Vaguely," I said. "Wasn't that the case of the barrister who walked out mid-trial and vanished for 3 days?" Holmes nodded. "When found, He claimed memory loss. Medical tests showed nothing. But he was never the same, nervous, subdued, plagued by hallucinations. Holmes held up the clipping. The barrister's name, Charles Durant. My eyes widened. Grimble's alias for the second apartment. Exactly. I believe Eberhardt tested his method years ago on Durant, and Grimble knew, perhaps even assisted. The journal entries refer to the forgotten man repeatedly. Now it seems Grimble used Durant's name for a reason: guilt, memory, or warning. Holmes stepped to the window. Gazing into the encroaching dusk, Eberhardt has laid a trail of vanishing breaths across this city. Grimble was not the first, and unless we act swiftly, he will not be the last. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The fog returned that evening with a vengeance, seeping into every crevice and corner of Baker Street. It lay heavy over the city, like an omen, dense, watchful, and curiously still. I had just drawn the curtains when Holmes straightened in his chair with sudden alertness. He sniffed the air once, then moved swiftly to the window. "Do you smell it, Watson?" I joined him and took in a deep breath. There was something acrid beneath the usual city smoke sharpness, faint but unmistakable. "Chemical," I murmured. "Faintly medicinal. Camphor, perhaps." "Not ordinary smoke," Holmes muttered. "He's near." A sharp knock at the door shattered the stillness. Mrs. Hudson opened it, and a constable stood silhouetted in the gaslight. "Urgent message from Inspector Lestrade, sir. There's been another incident." Holmes took the envelope and opened it on the spot. His eyes narrowed as he read. "Second victim. Same symptoms. Collapse without sign of struggle. Body discovered in locked room at Whitehall Club. Possible link to Thanamark Holdings. Victim, Edmund Harford." I felt the blood leave my face. "The man we questioned just this morning." Holmes nodded grimly. "So the killer moves faster now." Harford knew more than he admitted. Dan, someone feared what he might yet say. The Whitehall Club was a bastion of old London wealth, polished oak walls, crystal decanters, and leather chairs worn by generations of quiet men with louder secrets. We arrived to find... I stepped forward. "So you were involved with the Ventus Protocol?" Addington nodded slowly. "I funded a portion of the research, yes. I believed it was to be used for battlefield sedation, smoke bombs that calmed rather than killed." But Grimble began muttering about other uses: civilian, political, psychological. When I pressed Eberhardt, he said I lacked the imagination to understand what silence could truly accomplish. Holmes studied him, and when Grimble turned, Eberhardt struck. "Yes," Addington whispered. "And now he's loose, his compound refined, his conscience absent." Holmes folded his arms. "Then I suggest you consider carefully your next move, my lord, because you are not merely a witness, you are a target, and Eberhardt is not finished." Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat with one boot over his knee, staring into the dying fire. The darkness in the room was thick, almost velvety. "He's drawing us toward something," he murmured. "Not just a final demonstration, but a philosophical conclusion. He believes silence is superior, that breath is treacherous, that memory must be sculpted." I poured myself a brandy. "Then what's his endgame?" Holmes looked at me. "To vanish," he said. "Not merely to escape, but to erase himself so thoroughly that even memory yields. No record, no pursuit, only the echo of breath. That is the perfection he seeks." A knock interrupted our grim reflection. It was a telegram addressed in rushed handwriting. Activity observed at St. Anne's Chapel. Light seen from basement. Suspected return of subject. Awaiting orders. Holmes rose. Then the theater reopens, he said quietly. And this time, Watson, we must enter, not as observers, but as participants. Chapter 11. The fog had thickened to a near palpable blanket by the time we reached St. Anne's. The lantern Holmes carried did little to penetrate the gloom, casting more shadow than light as we crept through the ruined chapel's skeletal nave. Above us, the gutted beams groaned softly in the wind like weary sentinels. Holmes moved with a calmness that belied the tension crackling in the air. He had said little during our journey across the city, save for one instruction: observe everything, speak only when necessary, and be prepared to act on instinct. The basement door yawned before a Sodger this time, its iron hinges freshly oiled. That, more than anything, unnerved me. He wants us here, I whispered. Holmes nodded. And now, Watson, we shall oblige him. We descended the familiar steps into the cold belly of the church. The air changed subtly as we passed the threshold insert, touched with that same faint chemical temps I'd come to associate with Eberhardt's presence. At the end of the corridor, the laboratory chamber flickered with low candlelight. No sudden movements. He will not strike without precision. The chamber, when we entered it, had changed since our last visit. Gone were the dusty glass slides and abandoned apparatus. In their place stood a carefully arranged seeing-two chairs, facing each other across a narrow wooden table. Upon it, a single silver case and a familiar brass inhaler, and seated in the far chair, entirely at ease, was Lucas Eberhardt. He was younger than I had imagined, though his hair had gone prematurely white. His features were refined, almost ascetic, and his eyes gleamed with the fixed calm of one wholly possessed by purpose. I was wondering when you would return, he said in perfect, lightly accented English. You are precise, Mr. Holmes, predictably so. Holmes did not sit. He remained still, his gaze locked on the figure across the table. And you are theatrical, Herr Eberhard, but less predictable than you imagine. The German gestured toward the second chair. No weapons, no trap. You may inspect the room. I have come not to harm, but to speak. Holmes made no move. What is it you want? He asked. Eberhard smiled faintly. I want to be understood. You murdered 2 men. I silenced them, Eberhard corrected. There is a difference. Grimble betrayed the idea. Harford threatened it. Have studied it? Holmes narrowed his eyes. And what idea is that? Eberhard stood slowly, hands spread in something like reverence. That memory is a lie. That selfhood is merely repetition. Break the breath, interrupt the cycle, and a man becomes clay again, malleable, free. He gestured toward the inhaler on the table. This was never about warfare, not truly. The military wanted a tool. I wanted something purer. Holmes remained silent. Eberhard stepped around the table slowly. But you, Mr. Holmes, you see the potential, do you not? You live in observation, detached, controlled. Imagine being able to select which breath to carry, which thought to abandon. Would that not be perfection? You seek to unmake men, Holmes said coldly, not to perfect them. Eberhard chuckled. You see only the fear, not the liberation. Holmes moved at last, stepping forward. Then allow me to liberate you from your illusion. At that moment, the trap sprung not from Eberhard, but from Holmes himself. A sharp whistle from the stairwell echoed through the chamber, and within seconds, two plainclothes officers appeared at the threshold. Pistols drawn, Eberhard's face changed, not with fear, but amusement. You truly believe this ends with chains? He asked. You cannot catch an idea, Mr. Holmes. Holmes raised a brow. Perhaps not, but I can catch its author. The German's gaze drifted to the table. Then I hope you understand the cost. He reached into his coat with a sudden motion, and the constables stiffened, but instead of a weapon, he withdrew a small vial and crushed it beneath his heel. A vapor hissed upward, acrid and sharp. Out, Holmes barked. Now, we stumbled back into the corridor, coughing. The constables dragged Eberhard between them, who offered no resistance. His eyes were closed, and a faint smile played across his lips, as though he had achieved some unseen victory. Lestrade, pacing outside a private reading room, cordoned off with two constables standing guard, same as before, he muttered as we approached. Dead in his chair, door locked from the inside, no signs of trauma. The physician on duty says it's as if the man simply forgot to breathe. Holmes entered without hesitation. I followed him into a chamber that could have belonged to any gentleman in the empire, dark-paneled, warm with the smell of sherry and pipe smoke. And yet something was deeply wrong. Harford sat at a corner table, slumped forward, a leather-bound book still open beneath his fingers. His face bore no pain, no fear, only a calm vacancy, like a puppet left at rest. Holmes circled the room once, eyes sharp. Who discovered the body? Club steward, Lestrade answered. He knocked 3 times after Harford missed supper, forced the door. Holmes examined the table. A snifter of brandy, untouched, an open cigar box, and beside the book an unlit match resting atop a folded napkin. He picked up the match, sniffed it, then turned it over. Same faint residue, he said. Camphor, alkaloid. Watson High never lit the cigar. He lit something else, or tried to. He leaned down, examining the edge of the book. A thin layer of ash dusted the corner. Holmes retrieved his magnifying lens. Here, fibers from a burned cigarette, not a cigar, and not one from the club's supply. He opened Harford's coat and examined the inside pocket. From it, he drew a crushed cigarette case. Inside were 4 Murad cigarettes, and one that was ... Holmes removed the impostor carefully. The same, he said. Manufactured to resemble the Murad's, same cut, same wrapper, but note the tip. It's been laced, coated with a substance that would activate upon lighting. I frowned, but Harford didn't light it. No, Holmes said, because he recognized it. Too late, he tried to discard it. The residue on the napkin, the match left unused. He knew, but the fumes, even faint, were already working. He rose slowly. Eberhard is accelerating. The first death was symbolic. The second is a warning. Lestrade crossed his arms. A warning to whom? To us, Holmes said coldly, and perhaps to Addington. Back at Baker Street, Holmes arranged both the tainted cigarette and the ash sample into sealed glass vials. He labeled them with precise care before handing them to a waiting messenger bound for St. Bartholomew's. If Eberhard continues this pace, Watson, he said, returning to his seat, there will be a third before week's end. I poured us each a glass of brandy and settled opposite him. But to what end? If he already proved his method with Grimble, why strike again? Holmes tapped a finger against the armrest. Because Harford represented a pivot. Grimble was the entry, Harford was the leak. He tried to stall us with vague answers, but by doing so, he marked himself. Eberhard doesn't silence those who don't speak. He silences those who might. He picked up Grimble's journal again and flipped to the entry we'd recently deciphered. He waits beyond breath not for death, but for silence perfected. The second will fall in full awareness. That is his cruelty. Holmes let the page fall flat. The second was Harford. That night I found sleep elusive. The image of Harford's expression haunted me, not pained, but empty, as if something fundamental had been erased from him before his final breath. I rose and entered the sitting room where Holmes remained by the fire, unmoving, as though carved from thought. He's watching us, I said quietly. Holmes nodded without looking up. Eberhard is studying the limits of silence, how far it spreads, how it echoes. Each victim is a test. But he miscalculates one thing. What's that? Holmes looked at me, and there was fire behind his calm. We do not forget, we observe. And I have just begun to lay the bait. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. It was nearing noon the following day when Holmes summoned me back to our sitting room with a terse, two-word command. It's begun. I found him hunched over a half-disassembled cigarette under the lens of his brass microscope, a faint tremor in his fingers betraying the intensity of his concentration. He didn't look up as I entered. The sample from Harford's case confirms it. The toxin wasn't meant to kill at once. It was measured. The fatal reaction resulted from pre-exposure. Grimble's lungs primed the path. Harford's were already weakened. Then Eberhard calibrates his attacks, I said, slowly sitting. He doses first and strikes later. Holmes nodded. And only if the subject becomes inconvenient. Both men were involved in the same chain Thanemark holdings. But why murder Grimble so publicly and Harford with such restraint? The answer lies not in method, but in message. He stood suddenly and retrieved a dossier from the shelf. Recall what Harford said in the Thanemark office, something about a Ventus protocol, masked as a medical project. Barely, I replied. He danced around it. Holmes dropped the file in front of me. It wasn't just a medical project. I had Mycroft inquire through unofficial channels. Ventus was a covert research initiative backed partially by private interests in the War Office. I blinked. You mean government? Not officially, Holmes said. But the funding links trace back to advisory boardsmen concerned with battlefield innovation. They believed Eberhard's compound could be weaponized. I felt the weight of that revelation settle in my chest. To make men forget, surrender, confess. Precisely, Holmes said darkly. A toxin without trace that weakens resolve, clouds memory, and breaks identity without bloodshed. More effective than interrogation. He tapped the side of his pipe. Grimble helped build that bridge, perhaps unwittingly, but when he grasped the implications, he tried to undo it. That's what his journal tells us. He planned to reveal everything, and Harford facilitated the money flow. Once he saw Grimble's death, he likely panicked. You saw it in his eyes during our interview. He was preparing to talk. I stood and paced to the window. So Eberhard isn't just tying off loose ends, he's defending a secret that could reshape war itself. Holmes joined me, silent for a moment. Then he said, "And he's no longer working alone." I turned sharply. "What do you mean?" Holmes returned to his desk and opened a new telegram that had arrived just minutes earlier. Surveillance of Addington's estate. Unknown visitor arrived last night. Tall man, blonde hair, walking stick. Left through rear gate at 2:13 a.m. Destination unclear. It seems our silent chemist paid another visit to Lord Addington, Holmes said. A midnight audience. And not announced, of course. I sat back down. Then Addington's still involved. Perhaps more than he admits. Holmes was already donning his coat. Which is why we shall pay him one final visit. And this time, Watson, we shall not leave until we know the full truth. We arrived at the Addington estate just past 2 o'clock. The clouds had thickened, and the wind carried a chill that gnawed at the edges of one's coat. Lord Addington received us in his study, his face drawn and hollow, as if sleep had evaded him for several nights. "You've returned," he said flatly. "I suppose I should have expected as much." Holmes stood near the fireplace, his tone as cool as the room. "We have reason to believe Lucas Eberhard visited you last night." Addington's hand twitched, but he said nothing. "He left by the rear gate," Holmes continued. "Unobserved, he thought, but he was seen. And you, my lord, are quickly running out of excuses." Addington turned toward the fire, his shoulders rigid. "He came to threaten you, didn't he?" Holmes asked. "No," Addington replied after a long pause. "He came to warn me." "Warn you of what?" "That he would not be stopped," Addington said. "That if I spoke further to the press or to the Yard, I would end as Grimble did, quiet, forgotten. He said he would leave me with my lungs intact, but only if I remained silent." Back at Baker Street that night, the windows were flung open to let the fresh air wash through. Holmes sat quietly, his violin untouched beside him. The brass inhaler now locked in a glass case on the table. "He allowed himself to be caught," I said, still shaken, double quotes. "Yes," Holmes replied. "Because it was never about escape." I stared at him. "Then what?" Holmes took a long breath. He wished to demonstrate that even surrounded, even seized, he held control. The vial, he called it, vaporum tranquillitatis. Not lethal, but enough to disorient, to remind us that breath is his domain. And now, Holmes glanced at the locked case. "Now we test his compound. We analyze every trace. We prevent his method from vanishing with him." I nodded. "And Ebert?" Holmes leaned back, expression unreadable. "He sits in a sealed cell beneath Scotland Yard. For now, but mark my words, Watson, men like him do not vanish in smoke. They drift, reappear, reform, because what they create lingers." He turned to the fire, but this time, the air does not belong to him. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The following days passed in an eerie stillness. Though Eberhard sat confined within a reinforced cell at Scotland Yard, guarded round the clock, and denied access to even the faintest whiff of tobacco, the unease did not lift. It lingered in the corners of the air, as though his philosophies, like his vapors, had escaped containment and drifted unseen through the cracks of London itself, ever more pensive since the capture, spent long hours before the fire, speaking little and playing even less. When I pressed him, he would only mutter, "Something's amiss, Watson. Not with the man but with the silence he's left behind." It was on the fourth morning, during our breakfast, that Lestrade arrived. He looked exhausted, his collar loose and his voice hoarse. "He hasn't spoken," he said, without preamble. "Not a word since the arrest. No demands, no questions, no plea. Just sits there with that smile, like he's already finished something we've yet to notice." Holmes set down his teacup. "Then perhaps we should stop waiting for his words and listen instead to what remains unspoken." Lestrade frowned. "You mean the lab?" "No," Holmes said. "I mean the pattern. Grimble, Harford, and now Eberhard himself fall connected through a single breath. And yet none of them delivered the message he intended." He rose suddenly and went to his desk, withdrawing Grimble's journal once more. He opened to a page he had marked, but not yet deciphered. "This entry has troubled me for days. The code is correct. The symbols follow. But the phrasing is ... elusive." He read aloud. "The mirror breath was never mine. He left it before I knew. If this reaches you, remember, the final breath was planted, not drawn." I leaned in. "You think Grimble's death wasn't from the cigarette?" Holmes gave a curt nod. "Exactly. It wasn't inhaled, was placed. Which means someone else was in the room before Addington returned. Someone who didn't simply leave the cigarette, but arranged the entire scene." I blinked. "No," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing. "Eberhard left no sign of entry. And remember, the chair was untouched. The cigarette burned cleanly. No ash, no residue, which means Grimble had already expired before the fire burned the tobacco. But then who—" Holmes turned to me, and I saw in his gaze the gleam of recognition. "Addington," he said softly. "It was always Addington." We arrived at Lord Addington's estate within the hour, this time unannounced. The butler attempted to stall us, but Holmes swept past him with such authority that even the staff dared not intercede. Addington stood at the hearth in his drawing-room, his eyes dark and shadowed. He turned at our arrival, his expression neutral, but the tension in his frame was unmistakable. "I trust this is not a social call," he said quietly. "No," Holmes replied. "This is a reckoning." Addington sighed. "I wondered how long it would take you." Holmes stepped closer. "It wasn't Eberhard who placed the final breath. It was you." The silence that followed was immense. Addington's face twitched barely but enough. "You feared what Grimble might expose," Holmes continued. "You funded Eberhard, but you didn't understand the full scope of his work until it was too late. And when Grimble tried to confess, you panicked." "I did not murder him," Addington said, his voice brittle. "No," Holmes replied. "But you induced his death. You found him already weakened, possibly exposed, during a prior meeting with Eberhard. You entered that room and placed the compound-laced cigarette between his fingers, then arranged the scene to suggest he had died mid-conversation." Addington sank into his chair. He was raving. He said Eberhard had poisoned thought itself, that men would breathe and forget who they were. I thought if I could control the fallout, quietly would end. But it never does, Holmes said. Eberhard saw to that. He let you act. let you believe you were preserving the greater good. In truth, he used you to prove his theory that fear breeds silence more effectively than any toxin. Addington covered his face with both hands. I buried Grimble to protect London, he whispered. No, Holmes said. You buried him to protect yourself. We left the estate in silence. Holmes did not speak until we were halfway back to Baker Street. The cab rattling through streets slick with morning drizzle. Eberhard never needed to deliver the final dose, he said. He merely needed to plant the seed and let fear administer the rest. So Addington's conscience did the work. Holmes nodded. Grimble's journal was a confession, but also a misdirection. Eberhard wanted us to follow the trail just long enough for Addington's guilt to ripen. And now, the true test begins. I looked at him. What test? Whether London remembers. That evening, Lestrade formally charged Lord Addington with obstruction of justice and tampering with a death scene. Eberhard, for his part, said nothing, only watched the proceedings, with the detached serenity of a man who had written the final chapter long before the first had begun. Holmes stood at our window that night, staring into the endless curl of fog. Some crimes, Watson, he murmured, do not echo with a scream but with a breath. I joined him, and some murderers, he added softly, never lift a finger, only a thought. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape it was 3 nights after Lord Addington's arrest, when the silence was broken not by gunfire or scream, but by a flicker in the gaslight outside Scotland Yard, a subtle breach in the fortress of law itself. At precisely 1 o'clock in the morning, a constable on patrol noticed that the sealed ventilation shaft above the lower cells had been forced open from within. 30 minutes later, Lucas Eberhardt's cell was found empty. There was no struggle, no broken lock, no discarded tool. Only a faint trail of soot across the cot and a single word written in ash upon the wall. Remember. By the time Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, just after dawn, the alarm was spreading like fire across the yard. The chemist who had made murder a matter of breath had vanished into the fog once more. He's gone, Lestrade said grimly, slumping into the chair across from Holmes. Vanished. The lock was untouched. But the vent, God help us, the vent led into the disused coal chute. He must have planned it from the beginning. Holmes, as composed as ever, nodded once. The prison was never his cage, only a corridor. Lestrade scrubbed his hands across his face. We've locked down every train station, every dock, every coach line. We've posted men from Aldgate to Richmond. He will not leave by conventional means, Holmes said. He's too committed to his myth. He will make his final move from within the fog, somewhere close, familiar, symbolic. I leaned forward. You believe he still has a purpose? Of course, Holmes said. His message is incomplete. Grimble, Harford, Addington, they were only chapters. He requires an epilogue. Lestrade stood, pacing. If he's that theatrical, where does he strike next? Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he rose, crossed to the mantelpiece, and retrieved the sealed case that held Eberhardt's brass inhaler. Watson, he said, recall his final words in the laboratory before we arrested him. I frowned. Trying to remember, he said. I hope you understand the cost. Precisely, Holmes said. And what greater cost to me than the loss of reason, of memory? Lestrade looked up. You think he'll come after you? Holmes gave a faint smile. I would were I him. It was just past midnight when Holmes set the final piece of bait. He instructed Mrs. Hudson to retire early and arranged the sitting room with deliberate care. One lantern, low and flickering, the inhaler removed from its case and placed plainly upon the side table. Beside it, a fresh cigarette, UNLIT. He and I sat in near darkness, waiting. My nerves were tight as wires. He's watching, Holmes murmured, somewhere beyond the glass. I turned slowly to the window. The fog had thickened once more. No moon, no lamplight, only that strange pale void swirling beyond the panes. Then, without warning, a figure stepped through it. No sound preceded him. No knock, no rattle of latch. Just the slow, inevitable creak of our door as it swung inward. Lucas Eberhardt stood at the threshold. His coat was buttoned to the neck, his blond hair damp with mist. He looked exactly as he had in the laboratory. Composed. Deliberate. Neither of us rose. I came to offer you clarity, he said softly, as I did the others. Holmes tilted his head. Grimble died for clarity. So did Harford. And Addington. He destroyed himself beneath the weight of your breath. Eberhardt stepped closer. And yet you breathe still. You observe. You resist. Holmes reached toward the cigarette on the table. Shall we test your theory, then? He asked. Eberhardt paused. You would inhale what I have prepared. No, Holmes said. I would offer it to you. And in that instant, the room shifted. 2 constables sprang from behind the doorframe, revolvers raised. Lestrade followed, stepping from the shadows of the hallway. Eberhardt's face did not falter. You invited me, he said to Holmes. I did, Holmes replied, on the assumption that your vanity would outweigh your caution. Eberhardt reached slowly into his pocket-hand this time. We were ready. Lestrade was on him in seconds. The vial he withdrew was intercepted mid-motion and seized. A glass bead filled with amber liquid similar to the compound he had crushed in St. Anne's poison. Lestrade asked. No, Holmes said. A memento. A symbolic breath. Eberhardt's expression remained calm. You believe this moment to be victory. Holmes leaned closer. No, I believe it to be conclusion. You see, Herr Eberhardt, we've not only caught you, we've preserved you. The vial, the inhaler, your journal entries all catalogued. Your science no longer belongs to you. It belongs to evidence. Holmes shook his head. Worse, hypnosis relies on suggestion. This relied on chemical entrainment, a compound delivered through the air that induced a psychological blank slate. Not death, not sleep, but erasure. I shivered. And Grimble helped him build it. At first, Holmes said, Tobias Grimble believed the protocol CRA could help veterans, trauma victims, those whose minds had been fractured by war. But Eberhardt had no interest in healing. His goal was transformation, control. Grimble realized too late and tried to stop him. Holmes stood and walked slowly to the window. Watching the fog drift past gas lamps like ghosts, he began leaving us pieces. The matchbox at the tobacconist, his initials, deliberately scratched in a place only a keen observer would notice. His ciphered journal meticulously encrypted, meant for someone capable of breaking it. The hidden dossier at the Lyceum Theatrical Sanctuary, one Eberhardt would never expect him to use. He turned, his eyes sharp. Grimble wasn't just fleeing death. He was creating a map, a trail of meaning to expose what Eberhard was attempting before it could be perfected. I asked, was he merely collateral? Hardly. Harford was the financial facilitator. He masked the funding flows from Thanamark Holdings to Shell Foundation's fronts Eberhard used to construct his lab and test subjects. But Harford grew suspicious. According to the last entry in Grimble's journal, Harford demanded to see the results firsthand. Days later, he died of what appeared to be a stroke but was in fact a neurological collapse induced by a prototype of the gas. Holmes paused, voice darkening. Eberhard was refining his formula, testing resistance thresholds. Harford was test number 5 and Addington, a different kind of death, Holmes said. Eberhard did not touch him with gas or violence. He sent him 3 pages of the protocol, wrapped in the handkerchief of a man Addington had unknowingly condemned. That was enough. The guilt fractured his mind. He drank himself into madness within 48 hours. Holmes returned to his chair and leaned forward. That, Watson, is the true brilliance and horror of Eberhard's design. Each subject was not murdered in the traditional sense. They were unmade. I was silent for a long moment, letting the implications settle. Then I asked what had haunted me most. Why you? Why come for you directly? Holmes offered the faintest smile. Because I was the final test. Eberhard believed that if he could dismantle my reasoning, then his method was complete. He arrived here not to surrender, but to witness. He hoped I would inhale the compound, even unknowingly, and that my unraveling would confirm the protocol's perfection. But you knew, I said slowly. You swapped the inhaler. Yes, Holmes replied, with a replica filled with camphor and eucalyptus, harmless, but pungent enough to fool him. I also lined the sitting room with smoke-dispersing charcoal filters 2 hours before his arrival. He glanced at the fireplace. I suspected he would come in person. Men like Eberhard always seek their masterpiece. And men like me, he added, with a wry look, tend to be their canvas. The rest of the evening passed in reflection. We spoke little, but the quiet was no longer oppressive. It was the hush of understanding after long confusion that night. I recorded every detail in my journal, the clues, the red herrings, the way Holmes had not only chased the truth but predicted its form. It was not a murder mystery in the classic sense, but a philosophical crime against consciousness. Before I retired, I turned to him once more. Holmes, I asked, what becomes of Eberhard now? He exhaled a long stream of smoke. He will be confined, observed, perhaps studied, though I shudder at the idea. But his method is sealed, and the formula will not see light. I nodded. Still, he succeeded in one sense, didn't he? Holmes looked up. He made us doubt the air we breathe. Then he smiled faintly, solemnly. But doubt, Watson, is the beginning of wisdom. And so long as we breathe with memory, we are safe. For the first time, something flickered behind Eberhard's eyes. Doubt, or perhaps grief. You've frozen it, he whispered. You've made it mundane. No, Holmes said. We've made it comprehensible. Lestrade cuffed him without ceremony. You'll hang, I expect. Eberhard offered no protest. He only glanced one final time at the window. At the swirling fog beyond, as he was led away, I heard him murmur, even air forgets its shape after they were gone. Holmes stood for a long time before the open window. "He was right about one thing," he said at last. I asked. "That memory is delicate, treacherous, subject to influence." He turned back to the sitting room, now returned to its ordinary stillness, but it is also resilient. And when sharpened by reason indelible, chapter 14, Holmes closes in, the final clue revealed was a strange calm that followed Eberhardt's capture, like the hush in the aftermath of a storm whose thunder had only half passed, though Scotland Yard had their man, and the apparatus of justice was already grinding into motion. Holmes' mood remained curiously unsettled. There was no triumphant return to the violin, no brisk energy to his pace. Instead, he spent hours standing by the hearth, pipe in hand, frowning into the smoke as if it still held secrets unburned. I had thought Eberhardt's final visit and Holmes' brilliant trap had sealed the case. Yet something lingered in unease in the air, not unlike the chemical residue we'd come to associate with the man. It was during one such silence, 3 days after the arrest, that Holmes suddenly turned to me. "Do you recall the matchbox Grimble left behind at the tobacconist's?" I nodded. "The one with his initials scratched into the lid. You said it was a warning." "Indeed, but I've been reconsidering its timing. It was found before his death, not after. Which means it wasn't a dying message, it was a signal, a breadcrumb, a signal to whom?" Holmes smiled faintly. "To us, or, more precisely, to anyone following the trail. Grimble feared he would be silenced, and so he planted markers, physical clues, to draw attention, not just to but to what Eberhardt was preparing." He crossed the room to the shelf and retrieved Grimble's coded journal, flipping rapidly to the final pages. "Here," he said, pointing to a sequence of symbols we had previously set aside as mere poetic musings. "The breath retreats behind the velvet, beneath the silver voice, where fire once whispered and the mirror burned." "Symbolic language," I said, "but layered with meaning." "Exactly," Holmes said. "We assumed he referred to the chamber at St. Anne's, but I now believe he spoke of a different location, entirely one that would complete the puzzle." He paced. "Think, Watson. Velvet silver voice, where fire whispered. These are not random metaphors. They are theatrical." I blinked. "You mean a theater?" Holmes snapped his fingers. "Precisely. Grimble's final meeting before his death occurred not at his office or home, but at the Belgrave Lyceum private box, reserved under an alias. We thought it unrelated. But what if it wasn't?" "You believe he left something there?" I asked. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "I believe he left everything." The Belgrave Lyceum was an aging but stately hall nestled in a quiet corner of Westminster. Its red velvet curtains and tarnished chandeliers recalled a more flamboyant era, and its private boxes were used now more for clandestine meetings than for appreciation of art, with Lestrade's assistance. We gained access to the theater's upper gallery. The box in question, box 7, stood untouched since Grimble's final reservation, its door locked and its velvet cushions coated in a fine layer of dust. Holmes entered with restrained urgency, eyes sweeping the walls, the armrests, the carvings beneath the box's railing. He ran his fingers along the wainscoting, then paused. "Here," he said. "Note the panel behind the chair." He pressed gently, and with a faint click, a section of the wall gave way to reveal a shallow compartment. Inside lay a leather-bound envelope, sealed with red wax, and a folded handkerchief embroidered with the initials L.E. Holmes opened the envelope carefully. Inside were 5 sheets of dense writing and a single photographic slide. I looked over his shoulder. The first page was titled simply, Protocol Craw, the final formula. It's his complete design, I whispered. Eberhardt's full methodology, refined, documented. Holmes nodded grimly, and Grimble hid it here, knowing that only someone persistent enough to decipher his path would find it. He examined the final page, a handwritten note in Grimble's own script. To whoever follows, this is what he intends. Not war, but transformation. Not silence, but reprogramming. Burn this, or understand it, but do not ignore it. It listens. I turned to Holmes. What does he mean it listens? Holmes tucked the pages into his coat. That Eberhardt's method isn't merely chemical, it's psychological. Once the idea is planted, that breath can betray, that silence can override identity, the subject begins to fracture. The mind does the rest. He pocketed the slide carefully. This document is the final clue knot of how Grimble died, but why? And what Eberhardt hoped to unleash. That evening, Holmes summoned Lestrade to Baker Street. We laid the envelope's contents before him. Lestrade read slowly, his brow creasing deeper with each page. My God, he muttered. If this had reached the wrong hands, it still might, Holmes said. Which is why it cannot be locked in a filing cabinet, nor destroyed. Lestrade looked up. Then what do you propose? That it be archived with dual oversight, medical and legal. The Yard must retain the material, but the Medicorum Institute must review it ethically. Its danger lies not only in its use, but in its allure. He closed the final page. We must understand the thing before we can ever hope to guard against it later. As the gaslights flickered low and the city slipped into its uneasy sleep, I found Holmes again at the window, staring into the smoke curling from his pipe. We have the final piece, I said. He nodded slowly. Yes, and with it, the recognition of what? That the most dangerous crimes, Holmes murmured, are not those of rage or greed. Eberhardt believed he was remaking the world one breath at a time, and Grimble believed he could stop him before it was too late. He exhaled. It was almost too late. Chapter 15. The final gathering. By the evening of the following day, the players had all been summoned. The chamber chosen was not the courtroom at Scotland Yard, nor the interrogation suite beneath it, but a private salon inside the Athenaeum Clubber Room, paneled in dark wood, with long velvet drapes drawn tight against the London twilight. Holmes had requested it specifically, citing the necessity of containment and discretion. Lestrade, after much grumbling, had acquiesced. I arrived just before the hour struck 7, and Holmes was already there, standing motionless before the hearth, fingers laced behind his back, eyes distant but alert. On the central table before him sat 3 chairs in a deliberate triangle, and beyond them another row of 5 like an audience, waiting for a play they could neither alter nor pause. You've set the stage, I remarked. Holmes did not smile. Now let us see who plays to the end. The first to arrive was Lord Addington, brought under tight escort. His once regal bearing had withered. The proud shoulders were now sloped, and his face bore the ashen complexion of a man who had witnessed his own legacy collapse. He said nothing as he was shown to his seat. though his eyes flicked once toward Holmes with a mixture of loathing and reluctant awe. Next came two members of Thanamark Holdings, boardmen of finance, and clean hands, with their solicitors in tow. They had claimed ignorance of the Ventus Protocol, but the ledger Holmes had recovered from the Lyceum said otherwise. Their expressions were taut with restrained panic. Then came Dr. Albrecht Wilmer of the Medicorum Institute, an aging man with spectacles perched at the tip of his long nose and fingers, stained faintly with iodine. He had flown from Zurich at Holmes' request, and brought with him a confidential report. Holmes had insisted he prepare a psychological profile of Eberhardt and an independent assessment of the protocol's viability. Finally, Lestrade entered with two officers. Between them, hands shackled, calm as moonlight, was Lucas Eberhardt. He did not resist the escort, nor speak when seated. But when he looked at Holmes, it was not as prisoner to captor, but peer to peer. There was, unmistakably, a trace of approval in his eyes. Holmes waited until the doors were shut and the lamps trimmed before he spoke. "I have brought you here," he said slowly, "not to accuse, but to reveal." The room was hushed, listening. Only the distant ticking of the mantel clock filled the pauses. You sit among the fragments of a puzzle whose full shape you never glimpsed. Tobias Grimble died not of natural cause, nor spontaneous failure of breath, but of design. That design passed through your hands, your ink, your silence. Holmes gestured toward the document laid out before him, the protocol Cray dossier. Recovered from Box 7, this is the culmination of that design. A method of mental dissolution, induced not through blunt trauma or obvious poison, but by manipulation of perception, breath, and memory. And you, he looked to Addington, to the financiers, to Wilmer, you enabled its creation in pursuit of influence, science, and profit. Dr. Wilmer cleared his throat. "Mr. Holmes, we were told it was therapeutic research. To treat trauma, addiction. We were not informed. You were informed enough to know it warranted secrecy," Holmes interrupted. "The minute your laboratory required that subjects forget participation, your ethics abandoned you." One of the Thanamark men rose. "Are we to be judged without law, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes did not flinch. "You are not on trial here, but you must understand what your cooperation has wrought." He turned, at last, to Eberhardt. This man's goal was never financial. It was never military. It was philosophical. He believes identity is an illusion, that control lies not in authority, but in access to breath itself. Holmes gestured again to the file. "He used your funding, your institutions, your apathy to craft a weapon that cannot be seen. That leaves no wound. That does not end life, but erases the self." Eberhardt smiled faintly. "You speak of fear, Mr. Holmes, but fear is only resistance to change. In time, they will thank me." Holmes turned his back to him. "You are not a prophet, Eberhardt. You are a mirror. You reflect only the cowardice of those too willing to compromise." He stepped aside, allowing Lestrade to take the file. "This document will be sealed, not buried, but contained. Its science will be reviewed under international oversight, not to harness it, but to understand it, so it may never be weaponized again." Addington finally spoke, voice thin. "You think this is over?" Holmes looked at him coldly. "For you, it is." There was silence. Eberhardt leaned forward, fingers steepled. "You believe memory is your weapon," he said. "But I ask you this, when the smoke clears, what remains?" Holmes answered without pause. The truth. Back at Baker Street that night, the silence between Holmes and me was heavy, but not empty. He stood at the window again, his profile dark against the fog. "You were right," I said. "This was no ordinary case." He turned. "Because the crime was never murder alone. It was the reshaping of perception, the death of certainty. And that, Watson, is the most dangerous crime of all." He lit his pipe and exhaled. But in the end, even Eberhard underestimated the power of remembrance. Chapter 16. The reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime 2 days after the fateful gathering at the Athenaeum. London was still grappling with the implications, though it barely knew it. The press clutched at speculation like drowning men to driftwood. A few tabloids whispered of psychological warfare. One even claimed that a German mesmerist had turned Parliament into a stage. None, of course, had the full picture. The true crime lay in what had almost happened, not what did. Back at Baker Street, a rare stillness had settled. Holmes had not touched his violin in days. He neither paced nor smoked with his usual ritual precision. It was the silence of completion, yet not quite satisfaction. I, for my part, sat by the fire with pen in hand, determined to record the truth as I had witnessed it. But something in the arcane complexity of the case still eluded me. Holmes must have sensed it, for he finally turned from the window, his gaze cool and precise. "You have questions, Watson," he said simply. "It is time they were answered." I nodded, setting aside my teacup. "Yes, I understand what Eberhard did, but not fully how. Nor, I confess, why it took the path it did. The clues, the symbolism, the theaterette, all feels like a shadow cast on a deeper wall." Holmes settled into his armchair and steepled his fingers. "Then let us begin at the beginning," he said. "Not with the crime, but with the idea." He spoke in measured tones, like a surgeon dissecting a body with clean strokes. Eberhard was not a killer in the conventional sense. He did not strike from anger, envy, or vengeance. He was a reformer, Watson. A fanatic disguised as a man of science. His belief was simple, if terrifying, that identity is an illusion created by memory and continuity of breath. I frowned. And he sought to destroy identity. Correct. He believed that by disrupting that fragile bridge, by interrupting memory's thread with what he termed a breath of silence, he could erase the self and implant new commands without resistance. Hypnosis.